5 folks that I really respect what they do and their work and in their areas of interest for a very long time, to offer their diverse perspectives on the near future direction of American landscape, whatever that means. So we may be thrilled, we may be depressed. We end with Kirk, so I know Kirk all too well. But I told him not to be too aggressive. But we do have drinks later if you're staying there. We will hear from, in this order, a longtime friend of the seminary and the institute, and was on our consulting group for a long time, and he was a nerd, as well as a number of people at that table. Nerds was the New England Religion Discussion Society that we had for many years.
I was not only a nerd, I came up with that.
That's right. He's the original nerd.
I think he came up with Hartford Institute, too.
Yeah, that's right. Jay Demarath is the Emil Durkheim Distinguished Professor of Sociology. Distinguished Emeritus.
Not American.
At the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Next to him is Cheryl Townsend Jokes. John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur, Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Colby College, and also a very long time friend of the school and institute. Next is Timur Diskaya, a long-time friend and faculty member at Hartford Seminary. He's Associate Professor of Contemporary Islam. Next to him is Barry Cosman, the Director of the Institute for the Study of Secularism and Society and Culture, and Research Professor of Public Policy and Law Program at Trinity College. And one of the key persons in the ERA study, the American Religion Identification Survey. And then, last but not least, we have C. Kirk Hadaway, who is the Director of Congregational Research of the Episcopal Church. Before that, UCC. Before that, Southern Baptist. Before that, an independent Pentecostal group. No, he's worked his way up the religious. The next thing he's going to do is be a nun and you know, or maybe Marguerite. But in any case, I have no idea what they're going to say, but I'm sure it's going to be interesting. So we'll hear from Jay first and go from there.
Thank you, Scott. You're more confident than I am. I want to talk about 5 dimensions of change that occurred to me, and I'll talk about them very briefly. When I first got into this field, I thought it was an exciting field. I thought it was a field in which some of the greatest works in my field, sociology, have been done with reference to religion. I'm thinking about not only Emil Durkheim, not my namesake, but Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, a whole host of people who were very much concerned about religion, in part because religion was part of the larger cultural game. And in those days, any sociologist's work is studied whole societies and the theory of whole societies, and religion had to be taken into the discussion. That is no longer the case today. Sociology has changed. Sociology is a series of specialties, and one of them is not religion, at least not much religion. And that, in part, is a function of secularization. I remember, 15, 20 years ago, having a great debate with Rod Stark over secularization. And it was a debate that consumed those of us in the sociology of religion. No longer. I think the game is over. I think everybody agrees there is secularization. It may not be the only game in town, and maybe secularization too, but there sure as hell is secularization as well. And I remember going up to Rod Stark once, we were graduate students together, and said, Rod, don't we agree about this? And he said, of course we do, Jay. And I said, well, why are we arguing all the time? And he said, it's just more fun that way. You knew that that's what he was capable of saying. But secularization does appear to be something that nobody much argues about today. This morning, in his very good remarks, Dan asked the question, is religion simply a part of the religious presence just in it, or does it really function in it? Is it really an important element in it? And he answered the latter. I would answer neither at this point. And that is secularization. It's secularization that needs to be taken into account if you're talking about the changes that are likely to occur in American religion. I mentioned that there's been a decline not only of religion, but certainly of religion in sociology, in my field. Now, nobody in sociology really goes out to recruit a sociologist of religion, at least not in secular schools. There are some schools that have a religious dimension to them by fiat, and they may do some of that recruiting, but not many. They may take a sociologist whose specialty is culture, institutions, and organizations, and is willing to teach a course on religion. Okay, every now and then that might be fun, but we no longer will compel people to either teach it or take it. I remember going in to talk to a good friend of mine who was a department chair at the time, and he said, I just don't understand. How could anybody think that anything so crazy as religion could be an important variable in any kind of explanation in social phenomena? And I said, then you better get used to some craziness around, because that's where religion has, if it's going to come back, has come back. And in fact, there is a little bit of that now, because religion has kind of left the United States as a topic, but it's traveled pretty well. And if you go around the world, particularly to the Middle East, or particularly to Asia, you find much more interest in religion. You go to India, and every sociologist there is an expert on religion. You couldn't function without it. But I still think that, as I like to put it, a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues in the sociology of religion came into it as religious sociologists. Most of them, by the time they've been in it for 15 years or so, have become sociologists of religion, and there's a difference. They're no longer religious sociologists, they are sociologists of religion. Well, so we do have changes here. Changes in secularization, changes in religion and sociology, but there are other kinds of changes too. For example, there is, I think, in American religion and religion everywhere, a kind of deinstitutionalization going on in religion. People no longer understand institutional differences. People no longer know the difference between an Adventist and an Episcopalian, and they don't care. The question is which one is closer to home and to a good nursery school. There is a whole series of questions about religion which weren't being asked when I came into the field, but are being asked now, and have in some ways pushed aside other issues that we thought were critical. It is the case, I think, that religion no longer is in the public eye, except possibly in the black eye. And I think the Spotlight, the movie that's just out, we ought to talk also to David Roozen, who's here, and ask him about the corresponding problems and abuses in Protestant churches, which don't get much attention, but are going to get more attention, as well as abuses about girls, as well as boys. But nonetheless, I think there is a kind of problem in that there is a shift in the whole way of dealing with religion. There's a blurring of religious faiths, and a kind of a diffusion of various kinds of religion, and that's something that needs to be taken into account. I have mentioned internationalization of religion. think now the sociology of religion has to be what we were not, namely very well informed about the Middle East, very well informed about the Far East. We had to know something, but we didn't really know much about it. American sociologists of religion, at least those in my field, were never expected to know very much about what was going on in Europe, let alone what was going on elsewhere in the world. We certainly didn't know much about Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. Now we have to know something about it, lest we can no longer pretend to be a card-carrying member of the faithful. So I think that there is a difference, so much of a difference, that I have changed my lead. Scott was nice enough to tell you that I like to be regarded on my business cards as the Emil Durkheim extinguished professor. That's my way of saying I'm retired. But in fact, the more important change, the more serious change is I don't refer to myself as a sociologist of religion anymore. I now refer to myself as a sociologist of the sacred. I think the really interesting question, the question that we are better able to address than any other subfield of my discipline or any other group in the country, as far as I know, is the varying kinds of the sacred that are available to people, how they function, and for whom, and in what settings. And yet, I think we are selling ourselves too short by focusing solely on religion and not enough on wider expanses of the sacred, different forms of the sacred that need to be taken into account. So, I have a lot of concerns about the way in which things are changing. It's not just that American religion is changing. It's not just that sources of research support are drying up. It's not just that churches are themselves changing, as Dave's wonderful presentation this afternoon indicates. But there are much more serious changes afoot, not only in the United States, but around the world. And we are people to study them if we get out of the immediate perspectives that concern us and begin to stretch a little wider. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I have what might be called a few quote-unquote scattered remarks. I'm going to get a snapshot of where I am and where my own trajectory is going in terms of studying religion, and particularly religion and race ethnicity in America, meaning the United States. Two characteristics, two themes that sort of grab, that I've been stressing to students, that readings that I've given them have stressed. And one of them is religion in America that is post-civil rights. That is post-civil rights movement. Not that they're not people still appealing for justice, etc., but the religion that is after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, in other words, that post-1965 reality in American society. And also religion post-Hart-Celler. So there's PCR, post-civil rights, and PHC, post-Hart-Celler, the immigration law that everyone is now complaining about because it never occurred to them when they created the new immigration law that people would want to bring their families with them. And I think that's this sort of undercurrent that when they say immigration is broken, what they mean is that people are bringing too many family members, but that's just a little sidecar opinion on my part. But I think those are the two features that we need to take into account as we make sense of the religious landscape, as we see the changing religious landscape. And also, I want to sort of appreciate Dave and the Institute because they generated a lot of opportunities for conversation. And I think, even though you're talking about sociology and religion shrinking, they also are part of the professional disciplinary force that helped sociologists re-engage with the mainstream by way of a section in the American Sociological Association. Most of us who study religion from a social science perspective find ourselves in SSR, the Society for Science Studying Religion, found ourselves in the Association for Sociology of Religion. And so we're always on the outskirts of ASA, and during the conversations that have been generated in this space and in other spaces related to people that I've met through this space, I think that that has been a disciplinary force that has enabled people who are also doing sociology of culture to have a conversation space in terms of varieties of religious experience. But we also should not forget, and next week I'll be in Atlanta, we have the American Academy of Religion. So that if you think that religion is a shrinking topic in American society, it may be a shrinking topic in terms of those committed secularists in terms of sociology, but when you get to AAR, you discover just how many folks are interested in religion. They are religious and they are interested in religion and engaged in tremendous conversations. The other thing that, and again, this is the snapshot from where, from whence I come. So one of the interesting things that's happening in sociology is the re-engagement with W.E.B. Du Bois. And in the process, I study my core concern, and all of my other little projects that fly out and show up in different places really have flown out from that concern, was making sense of something that African Americans call the sanctified church. What is the sanctified church? It is the African American term collectively for holiness, Pentecostal, apostolic, and deliverance congregations and denominations, some of which very large. Lincoln and Mamiya included Church of God in Christ in their 7 large denominations, which graduate students have started to call the 7 denominations of the Black church, and you have to correct them. No, they are the 7 that Lincoln and Mamiya chose to study, but if you look at Howard University's book on African American religious bodies, there are several hundred others that they did not. And they're very little, but nevertheless, they are national networks, and they network people and help them to both imagine and actualize community. So it's interesting to see what happens to our work when it goes forward. But the nice thing about re-engaging with Du Bois is discovering, quote unquote, that his attention to the preaching, the music, and the frenzy, when translated into late 20th century ideas, has us focusing on, and there's a wonderful new book by, and I'm looking right at her, I'm glad you want her name, it's in the bag in that room there, who has looked at the way in which Du Bois attends to the soul, and talks about and challenges us to look at the ways in which human beings attend to the soul. It's right on your notion of the sociology of the sacred. So it's post-civil rights, it's post-Hart-Celler, there's a group of folks rediscovering Du Bois, going back and asking and answering some questions that never got answered and asked. In this religious landscape, one of my projects that I'm working on right now, as I told you, there's spin-offs from all of this stuff in the Sanctified that I was doing on the Sanctified Church. And one of them, interestingly enough, is a paper that's in progress on the AME Church as a broker institution. I started the paper before the tragedy that occurred in June, and realized something that Nancy Ammerman and I had noticed several years ago, that still today, there is a tremendous level of ignorance about African American religious bodies, who they are, their histories, etc. When the tragedy happened in Charleston, it was interesting to listen to reporters totally ignore the reality of the AME Church, to just totally ignore it. And when President Obama gave the eulogy, folks were sort of blown away that, he launched into Amazing Grace. Well, from an African American perspective, the only thing President Obama did wrong as a preacher was once he raised the hymn, he should not have started talking again. But if you look at the visuals, and it's interesting that no reporter, not CNN, not MSNBC, and I'm watching the news to see what they say, to see how badly they vulgarize the roles of the people. They were totally clueless to the fact that the entire board of bishops of the AME Church was there and rose. In other words, stood up with him, did something very traditionally African American in response to the preacher, stood up with him as he, quote unquote, raised the hymn. They also, there was no mention whatsoever of any of the other national offices. It was the equivalent of if a Catholic priest in the United States had been assassinated and the entire, basically all of the bishops of the United States Catholic Church had decided to come to the funeral. And there was no commentary whatsoever on that. There was no understanding of how nationally connected this incident was. And what was also interesting was the political engagement and re-engagement that had been traditional AMA, but was also highlighted through this, and something that South Carolinians had been working on for years and years and years. Bishop, now retired, John Hurst Adams, had led a march of something like 15,000 people to try to bring down that Confederate flag next to the Capitol. And the only thing they had done was move it from the top of the Capitol to the side. And so this had been something that had been persistently pushed on, and all of a sudden it was happening. And again, there was no understanding on the part of the public in terms of what this church was, who these people were, who were these bishops. No commentary on this woman bishop who had been to the White House several times. It's interesting to see, as I've been working on this, how much news has not occurred about President Obama's religious experience and his relationship that has grown over the 8 years with the AME Church. So that's another, I'm betting that when he leaves office, he becomes AME, but he won't. So, in terms of this post-civil rights, post-Hart-Celler religious landscape, my studies of the African American religious experience also tell us that we need to look at the technologies that various states, not just traditional Christianity in the United States, but Peggy Levitt's book, God Needs No Passport, points to the importance of the technologies of mass communication across local boundaries for the persistence of faith in community, for imagining community. African Americans have been doing it with tape ministries. They started out with tape ministries. Now you get CDs, DVDs, live streaming from various websites. And indeed, the crisis that occurred with during then Senator Obama's campaign for the presidency with Pastor Jeremiah Wright at the Trinity United Church of Christ, Trinity United Church of Christ, was dependent on these technologies of faith where sermons can be disseminated across a wide range of communities and to a wide range of populations without any kind of control or conversation that engages the folks. In doing some research on the contemporary church, one of the strategies that I used going into churches was to go to the tape ministry office and ask the sales manager to pick out your favorite sermons. I want to know about this, what's meaningful preaching, what's meaningful proclamation. Just have the people pick out the tapes for me to go home and go back to my office and study. And I've gotten some fascinating samples. And in one church I visited, I didn't get any by the pastor because that day T.D. Jakes arrived to be the guest preacher and set up product in the lobby. And so I got to ask his people to pick out sermons. And so I've been sampling that mass media and globalized mass worship, because as we look at also some of the social problems related to young people going on the internet and becoming very narrowly engaged with just one stream of discourse, some of it, of course, coming to us in terms of extreme, the extreme jihadism, and however they label it, that has to do with young people. It's not just Muslims, it is young Christians. It is young, not want to be Christians, it is young nuns finding ways to be spiritual that disengages from their larger community. So how do we deal with globalized mass worship? And I have some other remarks specifically to studying changes in the African American community. Brokering involves bringing in new ethnicities. If the Black church has been broker bringing in new ethnicities in the post-Hart-Celler area, what are other churches doing to bring in new ethnicities and engage them and connect them? We forget about the histories of early immigration into the United States, the pre-1850 immigrations, especially the multiple German-speaking communities that came, and how did they build very much larger churches? And we need to ask ourselves, how are peoples who are already here dealing with the new ethnicities as they're coming in? My work on the AMA Church as a broker institution is to find that that is actually happening. So let me stop here. One of the things that African American churches that I'm studying have discovered is that in spite of the post-civil rights reality, that in the words of W.B. Du Bois, mighty causes are still calling. And we need to ask questions as to how churches are addressing those causes that are calling, and where and when, where are there going to be new churches, changing class configuration. Ferguson challenges us to ask how many of the churches that people in Ferguson had to appeal to for help were in St. Louis, not in Ferguson. And what are we saying about the reorganization of the poor and urban life in this context? So I'll stop.
All right. I want to begin with an apology. I joined you all late because I was thinking of the future. And the future was Kaptala. It was not, really was not a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old who had a horrible cold. The 5-year-old brought it from his school. It happens to be a Muslim future because my wife and I was Muslim, and our kids hopefully will be in our. And one thing that occurred to me, this apology may be a waste of time, but it is also kind of emblematic of what I'm going to say today. And that is Muslim futures in the United States are interconnected with the futures of all other possible groups, religious and otherwise. And the viruses that this morning to me appeared uniquely Muslim, because I was staring at the Muslim kids, are actually human viruses. And they pick them up in public institutions, among other places, where they also pick up some wonderful things about values and viruses of those public institutions. And they, who they are as human beings will be and is as much influenced, if not more influenced, by the non-Muslim institutions as it is by the Muslim institutions because of who they are and where they are, which is in the United States. Now, because I have not been here in the morning, I did not hear if anybody said anything negative about David.
Thank you.
They did? Can I add something? So I was reading David's report on the decade of change, the previous decade, and I noticed how hard David was struggling to find notes of hope about the future, because our instinct is, as we look in the future, it has to be a bright one. So if I am going to depress you today, remember that my opening insight, which is now, not before, is that the future is bright. Now that you know that, you're all satisfied, remember that, and then we'll say something else. But the way that David was looking into the future was really cool. He said, in 2010, electric guitars and drums could be found in 1 in 4 congregations, a 14% increase from 2000. And that's an indicator of health and vitality among American religious congregations. Whether or not it applies to Muslim congregations, I do not know. Whether or not there will be more electric guitars 20 years from now, I do not know, quite possible, unless they will folk will find some other sexy instruments and ways of building communities that are resonant with who people are in those communities, and that is happening. Now, before I divert myself, I want to say that even though I do not know the future, I know the bibliography. And so what I'm going to be saying, if anything else, you'll get a bibliography. What I'm going to be saying is going to be based on 4, maybe 5 texts. One of them is a book that is going to be published. It's not yet published, therefore it's about the future. But, and the book is called Speaking Quran, and the subtitle is An American Scripture, and the author is me. And as I heard Cheryl speak, for example, I heard many resonances. And I also want to, since the future nobody knows it, and you go ahead and prove me wrong, I'm going to go ahead and venture and say that Obama will come out after he is no longer president, and he will become a non-closeted Muslim. I'm a religious person, I do not bet. So other than that book that's coming out, Speaking Quran and American Scripture, there are a few other texts that actually have appeared in the past, which I think may at least inform what I'm going to say. One of them is Ann Norton's book, published by Princeton University Press, I think this year, just very recently. And the book is called On the Muslim Question, which is an echo, a play on Marx's famous text on the Jewish question. If I'm going to come to it. The other text is Bruce Lawrence's book, New Faiths, Old Fears, which was published after 9/11, a couple of years after 9/11. Another text is a website which is accompanied by some clips, and then you can actually see the documentary, and it's called unmostfilm.com.
Say it again.
Unmost, like most, and unmost. Unmostfilm.com, like unchurch, unmostfilm.com. Unmasked. And another one is an article published in the Nation magazine back in 2014, by a gentleman named Mustafa Bayoumi. And the title of the article is For Muslim New Yorkers, A Long Path from Surveillance to Civil Rights. Now, why do I bring all of this up? First, Ann Norton on the Muslim question. Well, actually, let me make it second. First, Bruce Lawrence, New Faiths, Old Fears. What Bruce Lawrence suggests, and I think it's pertinent for Divine in the future, is that something counterintuitive, and when we talk about the future, counterintuitive maybe is the way to go. It goes against the trajectory of today's conference, for example. And what I'm about, it's somewhat simple. If you want to study and understand American Muslims today or tomorrow, it may be, just may be, useful to break the habit, which is dictated by all sorts of factors, of looking at Muslims as Abrahamic, representative of an Abrahamic tradition. Oh yes, we are. Our narratives are apprehended. For many of us, however, our experiences in the United States, from the point of view of kind of sociology of people's experience, are marked by the year of 1965. Many Muslims, perhaps the majority of Muslims in the United States, belong to communities that are immigrant communities, children of immigrants and so forth, and they're here because of the Immigration Act of 1965. Therefore, their experiences are based on kind of institutional realities that dictate who comes here and so forth and so on. Muslims in the United States are, for example, very proud to point out that the Muslim community overall is highly educated. And it's true. And one of the reasons for it is the immigration policy. And that is also true about Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs and so forth and so on. So from the point of view of sociology of religion, not perhaps the safety, but sociology of religion, if you are to look into kind of the future of the current realities of Muslims, it is well worth your time to compare Muslims to American Buddhists and American Hindus and American Sikhs and so forth, as opposed to American Jews. Perhaps the exception would be American Russians, kind of recent Jews, recent immigration of Jews. I referred to Alexei talk about the young character of Orthodox congregations, and I wonder what it has to do with immigration, right? So that may be right there. There are counterintuitive parallels which one has to look at. Another interesting thing, of course, and Bruce Lawrence does that in New Faiths of All Fears, which he studies South Asian immigrant communities, and he looks at Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims, and puts those three groups, looks into those three groups. Of course, the other thing about American Muslims is that they are extremely diverse. If you only look at the immigrant experience, you will miss a lot. And African American components, multiple components, are extremely important, including in places where some of the people you may study, some people I study, may not be even aware of. They may not be aware of how the way they speak, the way they formulate notions of justice, rights, what is right, what is wrong, what feels right, what does not feel right, how that comes from traditions which are African American and including Muslim. People may not be aware of where it comes from, but they speak the language which is indebted to African American articulations, and it continues to be so. Now, on the Muslim question, Muslims are a unique community in the United States today, not because they're so weird and have some viruses that are unique to them, but because they, after 9/11, they have become America's newest and most kind of singled out problematic minority. Many of the questions of what it means to be American, what it means to be religious and participate in public life, and so forth and so on, what it means to be secular and so forth and so on, what are the boundaries, how to be proper, this or that, are looked at through the lenses of what Ann Norton calls the Muslim question. And because of that, some of the trajectories that one might think are natural for Muslims into the future are likely to be different as well. So let me give you a few examples. So, Ihsan Bagir, who is not here, and I speak kind of in his spot, but I speak differently. He has done many studies of American Muslim mosques, and if you look at the trajectories of developments in American Muslim mosques before and after 9/11, some numbers really stick out. Women's participation in mosques in the lives of their congregations, for example, has been more recognized officially. So it doesn't mean that previously women were not active in mosques, but this kind of informal participation is being translated more and more in the formal recognition of the importance of women in the vital life of their community. And you can see many numbers of that, like 70% of mosques in 2011, 71% of mosques in 2011 reported that they have programs that specifically involve women. More and more congregations have women serving on the boards of directors, which is very valuable. Another side of it is if you look at places like some sources like unmosque.com as an example of that, that same number, 71% of mosques have programs for women. The people who are behind that documentary, folks whom I know and respect deeply, they interpret it otherwise. If you look at the website, the heading under that, over that statistics, they take statistics from Baghdad, and the heading there says second-class citizen. So the perception that they are trying to say is that women are, and they do not say it, but they imply it, still are second-class citizens in Malta. Now, you can take this number and you can say it may agree with some of the prejudices that some of us may have. Yeah, so this patriarchal structure, right? But look at it the other way. Here you have an example of groups within the Muslim community advocating for change, right? So that's where some of the things are unfolding. And with all of those things, so that's a positive kind of thing, I think. The other side of it is that the unmosque.com is responding to another kind of set of findings. Some of them are supported by numbers and some of them are kind of anecdotal, which speak to some of the things that you have addressed today. So the notion that, there was a Pew poll recently that found out that the younger people in the United States are becoming more and more secular, so to say, stay away from churches and so forth and so on. So one might say that that may be, if it is not currently the reality for Muslims in the United States, it may become the reality for Muslims in the future as the population kind of assimilates the immigrant folk. That may be the case, but then there is that Muslim question, right? This is where Bayoumy's article from Muslim New Yorkers, A Long Path from Surveillance to Civil Rights, to me is indicative of some of kind of counterintuitive ways that the Muslim community may live out their experiences in the future. And what Bayoumi starts the article by highlighting what many, at least Muslims, at least in New York City, know. Within that month of August, September of 2014, if you were in that community, you would hear stories about, oh, that mosque was just vandalized. That community was just assaulted. In some instances, the antagonistic experiences that took place between, for political reasons that have to do international dimensions. Because Brooklyn is an international town, and say there are people who are on different sides of conflict in Israel-Palestine. So that just comes out from those stories, right? Plus there is the surveillance, ongoing surveillance. The Associated Press got a Pulitzer Prize, a wonderful series of reporting about surveillance that NYPD conducted until recently and then officially stopped in Muslim communities in New York City and in other places like Yale and Princeton and so forth and so on. So this kind of notion that the Americans who are Muslim are being singled out for surveillance because of the Muslim question. So all of that stuff is very, very depressing. And yet, what Mustafa Bayoumi observes, and I have also had the privilege to observe, is that while that is the case, in the past 10 years, what has occurred in the Muslim communities in the United States, in New York City specifically, is actually quite remarkable. Because at the very same time, while under these adverse circumstances, the Muslim communities and their organizations have been able to establish connections with other civic groups and other religious groups and actually change some of the policies of the city of New York. Just now, the Muslim holidays were incorporated as official holidays in the New York City's public school system. It did not come out of nowhere. It came from at least a decade of quiet and sometimes loud work which involved Muslims from a variety of institutions, including religious institutions. And with that, there's that silver lining. As long as American Muslims remain a problematic minority, there is a kind of a double kind of a move in two different directions. One of those directions, however, is that this kind of adversity actually, in some strange way, I think has contributed to more healthy development of some of our institutions, of many of our institutions. And you can see it in Baghdad's numbers, specifically when it comes to interfaith. Back in 2011, 79% of mosques in the United States, 79, almost 80% of mosques in the United States have reported that they have been engaged in interfaith activities. Now, I do not know, there are sociologists here, maybe they know. I do not know any other religious group in the United States who can compete with 80% involvement in interfaith. The future is bright.
Well, the future. Experiences taught me that it's probably unwise to engage a lot in prediction prophecy. But I'm happy to provide a few reflections on trends. Over the 4 decades which David just left, in which he laboured in the vineyards of academia, change in the religious landscape has come at a faster pace than I and maybe some others here would have expected. On the macro level, we have experienced a realignment and a bifurcation of American religion as a result of two opposing tendencies. We've seen a religious revival alongside a rise in secularization. Religious piety and religious indifference both grew. The result has been a flattening of the bell curve of religiosity. The hollowing out of the centre. So, a marked decline in the appeal and the clout of liberal religion. Mainline Protestantism was particularly hit by this traffic going another way, or both ways. The trend towards religious polarization, of course, produced a culture war across society and culture. Now, the locomotive history speeded up due to large-scale religious switching. And that's due to, of course, the individualization, and you could even say a consumer culture of American society, or a consumer approach even to religion as a commodity. Think about it. Denominational labels no longer evoke much loyalty. The term Protestant has vanished almost from the public lexicon. And terms like evangelical and nun, as a lot of people hadn't heard of 30 years ago, have entered it. Now let me go with the first issue. Why has liberal mainstream failed to attract and retain adherents through these past 4 decades? It has become, actually, more open and welcoming, as we've heard, to women, the LGBTQ community, minorities, both as members and as clergy. Changes in liturgy, with new prayer books, updated Bibles, and hymn books, not helped. In the hope of stemming the tide and aligning with contemporary fashion, the Anglican Communion, the Episcopal Church here, abandoned what I regarded as familiar staples, the Book of Common Prayer, the King James Bible, and hymns ancient modern, to know about. Wider societal trends towards more tolerance of difference, lifestyles, openness of ideas, would seem to be ideal conditions for liberal religions to flourish. It should be springtime for the Unitarian Universalists. But they've not grown, and interestingly enough, neither do the Baha'is. Those actively seeking religion today seem to desire theological certainty and fault the liberal traditions for their lack of a coherent theology and praxis. On the other side, the seekers of social justice largely seek outside organised religion. Thus, paradoxically, if you want to find racially integrated congregations, you are more likely to find it among the Pentecostals and Adventists than the Quakers. Of course, the key to the future is the younger generation. Our recent national surveys, this is one I've done, my colleague Ariella Casar's American Religious Identification Survey series, we did national surveys of college students and their worldviews. These have revealed a campus population that identifies as roughly 1/3 religious, 1/3 spiritual, and 1/3 secular now. The religious grouping adheres to normative religious beliefs and is loyal to what we all recognize as organized religion. The secular, the nuns, are increasingly composed of non-believers. It's no longer accurate to refer to them as the unchurched. They are religiously indifferent and irreligious. Many claim faith in reason and science. The apostates, the switchers of a former generation, who used to be the majority of the nuns, are no longer there in such great numbers, proportionally. Because and as a result, few of the young nuns we met have religious knowledge or education. Their parents were the dropouts David identified in his 1980 RRR paper, anybody know enough to remember. The spiritual are now the middle ground, the floating voters among the millennials. They are suspicious of organized religion and tend to distrust the clergy, but they are searchers and believers. In fact, they believe in a large variety of alternative faiths. They embrace syncretism. They like crystals, like Vega, Gad, and Meg. This analysis suggests a tripartite future for the American religious landscape, at least in terms of belief and behavior. I'm not talking about belonging. However, there are a number of imponderables, as I see the data. One is a persistent gender gap, which appears in a surprising variety of contexts across the religious spectrum. For example, among the students, the religious group had a balanced sex ratio, but the spiritual group was female dominated, and the secular group was heavily male. Ryan Craig and Rick Phillips and I have just published a paper based on the Aris Times series on the title, The Increasing Sex Ratio Imbalance Among Utah Mormons. Since many more men than women are leaving the LDS Church, there's an imbalance that impacts marriage patterns and is causing a surplus of single LDS women that causes the church concern. And I won't make the polygamy point there. But it happens, it's in their newspapers and it was confirmed by our data. Among Catholics, the Aris Times series has also revealed that men were more alienated than women by the priesthood, especially here in New England. These gender differences suggest a conundrum for religion in what is otherwise an increasingly co-ed culture and society. So the argument, the question would be, what does it all mean? Everything else is co-ed, but religion isn't. And people don't seem to want everything to be co-ed. They're doing different. men and women are going slightly different directions. Finally, I know that American Judaism has not been covered in this conference, but I think it's an interesting case study worthy of attention. Judaism, too, has seen a hollowing out of the center. Now, American Jews have long been seen as the most secularized population, and interfaith marriage has accelerated this tendency towards producing compromised, neutral, secular family units. But there's also a countervailing trend amongst in-married Jews, an Orthodox revival. Orthodox Jews, not Russian Orthodox, or Greek. One factor favouring this uptick is demography. Orthodox Jews favour early and heterosexual marriage, so they exhibit the above average fertility common to most conservative religious populations. However, I want to home in on two essentially religious factors. One is increasing regard for the value of the Sabbath as a day of rest, a break from the frenetic pace of the world today. There's a marked trend, or a visible trend, for successful Jewish yuppies who have children to seek protection from the 24/7 pressures of the economy by becoming Sabbath observant. This gives the individual a legitimate reason not to answer the phone or email for 24 hours and to spend valuable quality time with their children and friends. The other factor is theological. Orthodox Judaism posits a God who operates in history. What happens then when prophecy doesn't fail, but quite unexpectedly succeeds? The recent past has seen the ingathering on eagle's wings of the exile from the lost tribes from across the world, the restoration of Zion, and the desert blooming in a startup economy. All as prophesied by Isaiah and Zechariah, and as most of you should remember, promised at the end of the book of Numbers. This contemporary historical reality has produced a triumphalist Orthodox Judaism. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides claimed in the aptly named book, The Guide for the Perplexed, interestingly written, or ironically written in Arabic, that such historical events would signal the beginning of redemption, the Ulah. These developments in the Holy Land have also energized many biblically conscious evangelical Christians. Finally, let me flag the widespread apocalyptic discourse around climate change. Right? Secular people talking in terms of the book of Revelations. So faith and faith are changing the religious landscape, and probably will do so in the future. However, it's important to remember that, as my colleague and I, Ariella Kazar, wrote in our book, Religion in a Free Market, religion is no longer an inherited characteristic, but a matter of individual consumer choice. That's why faith and faith are even more important in a free market.
I'm the only speaker with the charts up here. I guess Clark Ruth was right when he called me an empirical fundamentalist. Before going to the future or towards it, I want to go back into the past and bring us up to the present. I was trying to remember when I first came to Hartford Seminary. I was, I think, 24 or 25. So I'm didn't fight my 40th year, it was either the 38th or 39th, but I'm so old that I don't remember when that was. Jack Harrell's not here to remind us. But in the late 80s, with the encouragement and support of both Jack and David Roozen, Penny Barlow and I initiated a study of religious marginality in America. At the time, and for many years prior to 1990, the level of religious identification and affiliation with religious bodies remained exceptionally high. 90 to 95% of Americans had a religious identity. Even though a large proportion of persons calling themselves Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, or Jews did not participate regularly in churches or synagogues, there seemed to be a certain softness to religious affiliation in America, which we explored in a Lilly-funded grant. Terming the two groups marginal members and mental affiliates, depending on whether the person claimed membership or simply identified with a religious group, we explored the beliefs, commitments, and religious biographies of these individuals. One commonality among the marginally affiliated religious persons was a disconnection from a religious community, which was difficult for them to restore or even initiate or reinitiate in the case of some. But they all retained a religious identity based on either past involvement, family religious heritage, and even a currently strong commitment to a religious faith, a faith that was disconnected from their idealized religious institutions that they had in their youth. There was also another aspect of the softness of a religious identity and affiliation that was troubling. The actual data on religious participation also seemed soft or even unreal. Beginning with the reworking of data from the Middletown studies, we came to the conclusion that religious participation had to be a good bit lower than self-reports suggested. There also was a sense that the overall level of religious participation had declined markedly since the 1950s. But most of the data suggested little overall change, and that if there was any decline, it was only among Roman Catholics. So using several procedures, including, in my case, counting cars in parking lots in Ohio, we were able to show that in all tests, widely accepted levels of self-reported participation that had hovered around 40 to 42% for many years were grossly inflated. Actual levels of participation were more likely around 20 to 22% in the 1990s, or about half what people claimed. And the reaction to this was strong and surprisingly negative, particularly from Andrew Greeley. Some people said, "So what?" We heard that a lot. "We already knew that." Others said, "You're wrong. Why would Americans lie about their attendance?" Well, the same reason they lie about their voting. And lean back on Gallup and even GSS findings. The consensus was that we were probably at least half right, based on no data whatsoever. But that attendance was, well, it's probably halfway between 30% maybe, rather than 20 or 40. Subsequent research also, based on self-reports but using time diaries, also reinforced the lower level. Our findings question the overall level of religious involvement of Americans and the image of the U.S. as the most religious institution in the world, other than Ireland. But rather than being 4 times more religious than the U.K., the U.S. was only twice as religious as the U.K., so still higher, but not as high. We concluded that the level of religious involvement in the U.S. was not only much lower than generally assumed, but the involvement had declined while identification remained high. There was an increasing level of incongruence between religion, between behavior and identity, and an increasing disconnection between what people were doing and what they were saying they were doing. Now, around 1990, things began to change in terms of religious identity, particularly, and also in terms of participation. Larger and larger proportions of the American public began to say they had no religion, even though early on many of these non-affiliates or nuns, as Barry mentioned, actually attended religious services from time to time. The rate of non-affiliation rose from about 7% in 1990 to 21% in 2014, according to the General Social Survey. And according to the Pew Survey, also in 2014, the rate of non-affiliation was 23%. Let's see, how does this work? Where do I point?
Scott, where are you?
Point it this way.
Point toward the projector.
Projector. I think
There's nothing on the other side.
I'll just do
There
it.
we go.
It's fine. Just tell me when you need a new slide.
Is it on now? Okay, let's see. Bring it on. In this chart, you see the increase both in no religion, parallel increase of people who have no religion, and the people who say they never attend church. So more people say they never attend than say they have no religion. But the increase is parallel. Now, it's doubtful, I believe, that the rate of increase will be at the same pace as a decade ago, but following similar trajectories in Australia and Canada. Very similar trajectories. There could be as many nuns as Protestants in the next 15 years, perhaps 30% of each. And it should be noted that in the Pacific states of the U.S., nuns already make up 30% of the population. In the 1970s and 1980s, the vast majority of persons who rarely attended or never attended religious services still saw themselves as having a religious identity. 80%. So those who rarely went still thought of them as something. Now this has decreased. Now nearly half of low attenders reject religious identity. Furthermore, persons reared with no religion are much more likely to remain with no religion. This was mentioned also. See, early on in the 70s, only a minority of persons who said they were nothing growing up remained. Most of them became something later on in life. But this steadily decreased until now. A majority of those who say that they were reared with nothing remain nothing. So they become a more stable, almost like a denomination. Or non-denomination. So there's now much more congruence in terms of identity and behavior than was the case in the past. Claiming a nominally Christian or Jewish identity is no longer necessary if one was reared with very little involvement and currently has no involvement. Religious culture has eroded so that the question of what you are religiously has become largely irrelevant. Being nothing, which has no ideological meaning for most nuns, very few say they're atheists as such, while falling short of a irreligious subculture is sort of a fallback option for people for whom a religion is meaningless. You know, in the middle of our research on religious marginality, Penny Mara and I were in Australia conducting poll data and commissioning several attendance questions on a national survey there. And while we were there, Penny's mother contracted a virulent GI infection in the middle of the night, at 2 a.m., for example. And at 2 a.m. at the emergency room of a church-related hospital in Sydney, amidst the various deinstitutionalized others that were in the ward, there was a young couple who were also there for treatment. For admittance, they had to complete a form. And one of the mandatory questions was, what is your religion? They looked at each other, somewhat mystified, and said, I guess nothing. That sort of perspective is increased both in Australia and the U.S. With such little connection to religion and no experience with it, fewer nuns are going back to the nominal religion of their parents, something that most did in the past. Young adults traditionally were more likely to shed a religious identity after they got out of school or claim they never had one But as they grew older, the majority converted to some religious faith. Now religious nuns may look to churches and synagogues like I look at Masonic lodges, wondering what might go on there, but lacking enough interest and curiosity to find out. The age structure of attendance and involvement is important, but not all that simple. There are and have been distinct age differences in self-reported attendance in religious services and in non-affiliation for many years. So this looks at, right now, among ages 20 to 24, 31% say they had no religion, 34% never attend. And among those, the oldest age group, over 75 or older, only 6% have no religion, 20% have, so they never attend. However, in the early to mid-1950s, there was almost no age or birth cohort difference in religious involvement. This is what I refer to as the Roozen chart, which I have updated, which combines the National Election Studies with the General Social Survey from 1952 to 2012. I haven't been able to incorporate 2014 data yet, but you can see in the early 1950s, there really was no generation gap in attendance. But then shortly thereafter, it began to split apart so that each the age cohorts tended to have lower levels of attendance than the previous age cohort. So by the late 1950s, the familiar pattern of a generation gap emerged whereby older people attended more, followed by middle-aged people, followed by median adults, and lastly by young adults. Soon, successive age birth cohorts were also attending less than the previous birth cohort as they entered into adulthood. However, oddly, the net result was stability in attendance, at least self-reported attendance, because Americans tended to increase their attendance throughout adulthood until they reached their late 70s. For the parents and grandparents of baby boomers, attendance increased to extremely high levels, almost unprecedented levels. And because there were so many boomers, their modest increase in attendance as they age also added to the stabilizing effect. So, a cohort effect, that is, decreasing attendance by successive cohorts, was negated by an age effect, increasing attendance by age. This chart is based on the intrinsic estimator, which splits apart the effect of age versus cohort versus period. So we're going to show two charts. This one is the intrinsic estimator of age, which shows that a tendency to increase attendance with age, and this is based on data going back to 1952. And then as people get really old, it drops off there at the end. So now, the next chart looks at the cohort effect. And at the end, it's a little, there's less data, so the standard error is much larger, so that's why it kind of splits apart. But you can see that the cohort effect showing a decline, particularly beginning with those born in the 1920s and later, a slow decline, but continuing so that age cohorts would attend less than the previous age cohort. But this is the reverse of the age effect, so they basically cancel each other out. Now, this situation lasted until baby boomers and Gen Xers broke the pattern when they entered their 40s. Just have a pointer on it.
Yep.
Where is it?
The red line.
Oh, red. Okay. All right. You can see that the two previous generations, that is the grandparents of boomers born in 1905, 1924, had this remarkable increase in attendance even into old age. But with baby boomers, they also had the same kind of increase until they reached their 40s, and then it plateaued. And then the same thing seems to be happening with Generation X, going up to their 40s and then plateau. You only have limited data on millennials, but they're not following this pattern at all. So unless something radical happens here, they may break the pattern of increasing attendance as they age. So something happened so that the baby boomers and the next generation, Generation X, did not follow. They began to follow, but not completely follow the pattern of their parents and grandparents. The chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak, as we predicted that they would, given the unsustainable disconnect between religious identity and behavior. And since adult participation in religion is so heavily influenced by consistent and reinforcing parental examples and consistent participation during childhood, the fact of the matter is religious observance will almost certainly continue to decrease. Religion persists best in stable, married families among persons who are reared in a strong religious faith by parents who share their faith and were active in that faith. What's wrong with this picture? Well, there are fewer and fewer people who had such a background. So, if both parents were active, 39% have a weak or no religious identity, but if both parents were very inactive, it goes up to 67%. David Roozen once observed that denominations grow as people join churches. That remains true because Christianity and other religions that dominate the American context do not take the form of large client cults, as to use Darton Bainbridge's term. People get their Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in community, in family, and in congregations. So the number and viability of religious institutions, as well as religious transmission in the family, have a significant impact on the religious trajectory of Americans and Canadians and Australians. It is not that irreligion is increasing in the water, but that the institutional form of religion is itself helping to, quote, topple the transcendence, to borrow a phrase from J. Demorat. Religion in the West has long been unnecessary at the societal level, but was seen as by most as positive and useful, and perhaps as necessary for many people personally. But now the general acceptance of religion as useful and positive has waned, and we are left with those who feel it is useful and possibly necessary for themselves. The churches and other religious institutions have played a part in this by becoming less religious in a successful effort to incorporate more people, and as a result, ultimately create the ground for their own irrelevance. Thus, we see mainline churches talking mostly about social issues, ignoring the holy, in a particularly tedious fashion. And evangelical churches also talk, ignoring the transcendent in a somewhat less tedious fashion. There are, of course, many churches that are vital, growing organizations. No, really, there are. But they're in the distinct minority. The best rely, I don't really have to stop, I'm the last one.
Don't you smell the food?
The rest rely on an increasingly older constituency who is comfortable with what they are being offered. But most people are not, especially young adults. The ones that are doing well, churches that is, and synagogues, are idiosyncratic and typically dependent on the personal charisma, the leadership, and or ritual showmanship, usually with a heavy dose of electronic media, particularly in the case of evangelicals. Most mainline pastors and priests will tell you that their children no longer go to church. In the words of my priest friend's son, Sunday morning is when you come in, not when you go out. And And as my daughter would say, Sunday morning is when you sleep. The children of evangelicals, even happy-clappy fundamentalists who try to insulate the children from a corrosive culture, are more suburbians than committed Christians. Or so is my observation. Evangelical congregations and Hispanic and Asian congregations are in better shape on average, but are experiencing the same forces as predominantly white and black congregations. Evangelical churches are aging, although not to the extent of mainline churches. Groups with more recent immigrants and higher birth rates naturally will do better, simply because they have a growing constituency. But the rates of disaffiliation are virtually identical among racial ethnic populations. Mainline congregations are in particularly bad straits because they have an aging constituency, poor retention of views, disaffection to the none category, few recent immigrants, few Hispanics or Asians, and a very low birth rate. That's the mainline situation. I still can't use the word old one. And in certain parts of the country, particularly in the Midwest, this means that growing vital congregations are almost non-existent. Congregations lose members, lose the ability to have full-time clergy, and continue to slip down the slope to where they eventually become unsustainable. Congregations fare best in situations where people are embedded in a coherent, reinforcing religious culture. In such situations, the relative quality or engagement of congregations matters relatively little. You can be a solid but not terribly exciting congregation that incorporates families and reared children much the same manner as other congregations in your denomination or faith tradition. But when congregations must sink or swim on their own individual merits or attractiveness, those that are lacking fail or succeed for a time, slip into decline when they lose their clergy or become involved in internal conflict. Furthermore, the children reared in even the best of these congregations frequently drift away from active participation because of a lack of religious substance they receive and or because they cannot find another congregation that is quite so good. So, the religious organizations in this country have been complicit in creating an environment that is fertile for a passive form of secularization that continues to erode institutional religion and subsequently for the less institutional expressions of spirituality.